In this video, we'll be reviewing Richard Rumelt's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, an exploration of what it takes to create good strategy and why there is so much bad strategy in the world. Welcome to Strategy Books, introducing leaders to the books and ideas that make a difference, and most importantly, the books that can help you make a difference in the world around you. Hit the subscribe button to stay current and that bell to be notified every time there's a new video up. I'm Mark Mullally, follow me here, and you can also connect on Twitter and Instagram at strategy_books. And as always, the links to everything we discussed today can be found in the descriptions below. So, let's get started. Strategy Books is wanting to explore the topic of strategy. And in this particular book, what we're doing is diving into strategy writ organizationally, and that's part of the overall value. And what I want to do is kind of talk about where this came from and why I'm actually reviewing it. And so my interest in this was, well, strategy, duh. And particularly the title grabbed me because it's a challenge, as I talked about in the introduction, it's a challenge for many to be able to understand what specifically strategy is. And what this book promises is a delineation between good strategy and bad strategy. And that's a useful delineation because strategy gets taken for granted. We assume that we know what it is, and we also presume to know how it's done. And there's an expectation that if we can just take people on a good retreat, come up with ambitious slogans, commit to working harder and more effectively, and set stretch goals, we can all realize the outcomes that we want to realize. And that is just not so. So the author of this book, Richard Rumelt, it's a name that if you are not familiar with the strategy field, you've probably not necessarily come across. And that's unfortunate because he's a former strategy professor at UCLA. As McKinsey has described him, he's a giant in the strategy space, but it's the challenge of being incredibly famous within a very specific niche. His focus has been, since he got his doctorate back in about 1972, working in and lecturing in and teaching in strategy and organizational leadership and organizational management. And he is one of the earliest pioneers of strategy research. He is a founder of the Strategic Management Society, if that's not an organization that you've heard of or found out about, but you are interested in the field of strategy. It is absolutely something that you want to check out. And he is a contributor to the development of the idea of the resource-based view of the firm, which was a strategically profound understanding of how resources get used to be able to create strategic advantage and to be able to create competitive advantage over other organizations. And so that's kind of coming into this. This is one of, it's the only populist book he's written. He's written one other book, which was basically it was a research agenda into the field of strategy. It was written several years ago. It was published by Harvard Business School Press. It is something that is probably going to appeal a lot to academics. It's one that appeals to me. But this is the first book that was actually written for a general audience. He does have one other book that's going to be coming out. I will link to that in the show notes in the description as well. But this was kind of the first book that he wrote that was really trying to introduce the field of strategy and his thinking about it. And this was one that was published in the late first decade of the 2000s, so it was about 2009 that it was published. And it basically takes us up to the events of around there. So within the book, we have a discussion of, for example, the global financial crisis. And we have some prognostications from him of how that is actually likely to play out. Now, we are 13 years, 14 years further on from that. So we've got a much better sense of how that actually played out. And what's interesting is in many of his assertions, he wasn't wrong. But it's basically placing that within kind of that strategic period. So some of the cases that he writes about are things like Global Crossing and Vivendi and Enron as case studies in bad strategy that got bought into massively on a world scale. And this is constantly a theme that we see, is that industry comes along, a concept comes along that seems to defy the normal laws of organizational physics. And not dissimilar to the dot-com boom in the 2000s, the idea that you could have a successful company with massive valuations and absolutely zero revenue and no plan to be able to get any revenue anytime soon. And the presumption that, well, the online space, that's just sort of reinvented the idea of what both success looks like and successful economics are. Now, that is complete bunk. That's the nicest word that I can use to describe that. But it was something that was widely bought into by a ridiculous number of people that should have known better. And that's kind of what Rumelt's point is that these fads, because that's what they are, that get bought into, they got bought into because people want to. Because they want to believe that something magical is possible. And we've been dealing with this since time immemorial. There's a wonderful book, we may actually cover it at some point, called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And it deals with the rise of, in part, the great... what was it called? Basically it was the great tulip. I'm going to use the word binge because I really can't come up with the word that I'm coming up from. The Great Tulip Craze, that's the word that I wanted. That was all of a sudden, it became a hugely valuable commodity that everybody bought into. Real estate has been something that has come and gone. We've seen it in the 1800s, we've seen it in the 1900s, we've seen it in 2000s. It was what fundamentally led up to the 2008 crash. And so we've got these periods of fundamental irrationality where the business press and to a certain extent organizational leaders and even scholars are arguing for a fundamental redefinition of what's going on. And the challenge with that is having the confidence of your convictions to be able to say, this isn't real. It's certainly happening right now, and there are people that are getting rich because of it. I look at blockchain for example now, but are the fundamentals there to be able to say that is a safe place in order to be able to put your money and you're going to get a reasonable return on that? Speaking personally, I'm not prepared to take that bet. There are absolutely those out there that will. There are those that will be successful, and eventually, likely, there will be a significant crash and a fundamental reckoning of the consequences of that. But today, the idea of blockchain, and particularly the idea of alternative currencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum and Dogecoin and whatever other coin that Elon Musk is talking up right now, they have that overall appeal and buzz that says this is the next fad, looking for a mark to be able to make a buck. And so when we think about coming back to the book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, what was the author actually trying to do here? And what's interesting here is that he was actually trying to do a few different things. And the fundamental point in terms of the topic of discussion is it's about good strategy and bad strategy. So obviously one of the things he's trying to do is be able to articulate just what constitutes bad strategy and how do we recognize it. And in particular, what defines good strategy. What he also tries to do and explore here, though, is the levers then that are available in terms of being able to explore and advance strategy, and to be able to highlight then the essential role of, and this is what I think is really important, personal agency and critical thinking in terms of being able to assess and evaluate what strategy can be, the reasonability of strategy as it's promoted and advanced, and to be able to think about how to respond to social hurting, avoid succumbing to the exceptionalism that does underlie magical thinking, and be able to be confident of your reasoning and your perspective and your ability to be able to pay attention to logic and facts in history and to make real objective sense of what's going on. Now, what's great about this book and what I love about this book is it is, for starters, incredibly well written. I don't say that lightly. I don't actually say that about very many books. But for everything that it covers, it is not a long book. It's just shy of 300 pages. It comes in at 298. And it has woven throughout it tightly crafted case studies and examples that illustrate every single point that Rumelt is making. And that's what makes it actually really, really wonderful, is that there are gems to unpack on each page. And it's one of those books that you can read at varying levels of depth. You can read it quickly, and the initial time that I did, I moved through at a fairly rapid pace, just absorbing what is this book is about, what is it trying to say, what is the message that's being advocated, what's the story that's being told. But it's one that you can actually dive in and basically rip apart and examine in detail and be rewarded for that effort. It's easy to follow in that you can see the logic of the arguments that he's made, and the illustrations of both good and explanations of bad are therefore really easy to be able to make sense of. And it's very cleverly crafted to be able to challenge your thinking. So for example, when he's describing situations where he is working with executive MBA students or executives working through a particular workshop or case study, he presents the logic of the case and what is revealed to the participants and what the challenges are that are being posed and the questions that he would ask and does ask of the class. And it gives you the opportunity to be able to say, well, how would I respond? What's my view? What's my thinking of this? And as you progressively move through that, to be able to reveal, well, what's really actually going on here? And so it's a tremendously well-written book that I really appreciated and really valued. In terms of gaps and concerns, though, one of the challenges in terms of good strategy and bad strategy is that history is judged in retrospect. When we think back to those fads that we were talking about, there were people that were sucked in and genuinely believed .com was a fundamental reinvention of the economic era and totally bought into the idea of just alternative economic reality. And for a brief period of time, there were people that made a lot of money based upon that fallacy. But how do you know in advance that that's right or wrong? How do you know that any strategy that you pick is going to play out successfully or unsuccessfully? And that's the challenge. We evaluate success based on whether or not a strategy did what it was supposed to do, or that a positive outcome that was realized as a result of that says, because of this, therefore, this was an exceptional strategy. And this is the thing. Every meaningful strategy that you can explore has risk associated with it. There are no guarantees it's going to work. And there are no certainties that it is, of all of the available things that you might do, the right call and the right course of action to actually make. But let's talk a little bit about what the book was about, and in particular, what I got out of it. And relevance to me, it is a reminder, and it's a really great reminder of what good strategy looks like. And within that, it's actually caution of just how rare good strategy actually is, and how rarely we see it realized and we see it being exercised by organizations. It's also, as a book, a really wonderful reinforcement of the depth and breadth that does exist within the strategy field and what it takes to do well, and how we so very seldom actually do the hard work and the heavy lifting of being able to make that happen, and how infrequently it actually occurs. But what it does is it highlights the myriad ways in which strategic advantage can actually be realized. Because it's the thing, there's no one right way and there's no one right tool to be able to do it. And a lot of what Rumelt talks about within the book is the idea that what's essential is being able to find a perspective, a viewpoint that actually creates a position of strength. Creates a position of alternative ways of looking for you, but also alternative ways of then potential being for the organization that create opportunities simply by shifting viewpoint that weren't then necessarily otherwise obvious. And so it's about, in part, creative reframing and rethinking of what's the situation that's going on, what's really happening here, and what's an appropriate response to that situation. What's an appropriate response that's actually going to realize a strategic advantage. And so my overall impression of this is a book that I valued considerably. It is practical. which is lovely because very, very often books sadly aren't. It is embedded within a career of insight and wisdom, like the thinking that he takes you through in terms of any number of scenarios where he's not just describing here's an organization, this is what they did, but organizations that he was up close and personal working with. And so there's an element of being able to bring you into the room and on one hand be able to admire the degree to which he had influence and opportunity within a massive variety of organizations, but also that he's able to then bring you close to the thinking and the challenges around that and what that actually meant. And as a book, what I absolutely love about it is it epitomizes the idea of show me, don't tell me. There is absolutely exposition within the book. He's describing, here is what I think bad strategy is. Here is what I think the essentials of good strategy are. But let me show you why. I'm not just going to tell you this is what it is and you need to go do it. I'm going to, for every point that I make, illustrate a case that reinforces and supports the assertions that are being made. So every point that's there is reinforced by some level of relevant example. And so let's talk about what it has to say. So we think about, for example, for starters, we think about, so what does constitute bad strategy? And he is delightful in his clarity of this. It is about fluff. It is about gibberish masking as strategic concepts, being able to take simple concepts, simple ideas, and then wrap around them highfalutin, multisyllabic statements that sound impressive, but don't actually say anything. He describes, for example, the idea of the strategy of a bank to be able to intermediate deposits with its clients, and so basically you're going to be a bank. Then you're going to take money from depositors and you're going to provide credit to those who wish to borrow. And there's no strategy there. It's just a fancy way of actually describing this is what a bank does. Bad strategy can be about failure to actually articulate or embrace or actually acknowledge, first off, the challenge that's being experienced and what needs to actually be done. And so one of his fundamental postulates is that good strategy is rooted in the problem. We need to understand what the actual circumstances and reality are the organization is dealing with to be able to assess and decide what needs to be done. Bad strategy is about mistaking goals for strategy. Our strategy is to have a profitability of 20% and a revenue increase of 20% by being the leading client-facing, client-supporting organization in our industry, as evidenced by exceptional client service standards. And it's like, that sounds wonderful. I don't know of an organization that wouldn't necessarily want to do that unless they had a profitability that was higher than 20% already, and few do. But the issue there is, well, how are you actually going to accomplish that? What advantage do you have that's actually going to get you there? What can you leverage? What can you do differently? What skill sets or abilities or assets or strategic resources do you have to leverage that's actually going to make that attainable? Or is that simply a wish, a hope, a dream? And this is the fundamental thing. Hope is not a strategy. And so we need to have more there. And so it can't just be goals. There's got to be some level of concrete evidence. And so this is where he delineates, well, what actually does constitute then strategy and what constitutes good strategy? And so there are, from his perspective, three fundamental points. First off, there needs to be a diagnosis. There needs to be an understanding of what is going on in this particular situation. And so, for example, he uses the case study of Starbucks. And particularly, again, we're positioning this in time. Starbucks, in about the period of 2007, 2008, they'd been through a massive amount of growth. They had been opening stores pretty much across North America and also arguably worldwide. And we're reaching a point of market stagnation, declining revenues, declining same-store sales, And they were dealing with, what does that actually mean? And so the diagnosis becomes part of the, well, what's the reality that Starbucks is dealing with? Is that because they are now facing too much competition? Is that because they have expanded beyond their capacity to be able to serve? Is that because client tastes are changing once again? Is that because people aren't really valuing the proposition of the third space that Starbucks positioned its market reputation on, and its viability in terms of what its competitive differentiation was, to be able to provide a third space that people gathered, whether that was to work or to socialize or simply to relax and really read and enjoy a good cup of coffee. And so the fundamental challenge in terms of deciding, well, what do you do about Starbucks, is to be able to understand, well, what's actually the nature of the problem? The reality is we have declining sales and we have declining same-store sales. Why? What does that mean? What's driving it? What's the underlying problem that's leading to that? What's going on? And depending upon how you interpret that, that leads to many possible different than potential solutions that you might proceed. And that comes just to the second point in terms of what good strategy looks like. There needs to be a general policy of how to proceed, and one that addresses and responds to the problem. And so until you've actually got a good articulation of what the problem is, you can't actually get to an articulation of a reasonable solution. You can't put a policy in place that says, in order to be able to respond to this reality here, we are going to proceed with this strategy here. And then the third dimension of that is to actually have coherent actions. And so there are meaningful responses that are responsive to the policy that's been articulated, that work to carry out that guiding policy, and that are coordinated and that work together to be able to deliver on the overall challenge. And that is an incredibly simple but powerful articulation of strategy. Because when we think about how a lot of strategic plans get articulated, there is a lot of fluff. There's a lot of wishful thinking. There are a lot of different things organizations are trying to do that aren't necessarily aligned, that aren't necessarily supportive and responsive to the problem, and some of which may actually be in conflict with each other. And so what he's gotten to is a very clear, very specific focus on what is the problem that you're trying to solve now, and what is the overall objective or policy that you can pursue to be able to address that problem. And what are those few select coherent actions that you can use to be able to deliver on that? Not here's ambitious goals unfounded in reality. Not here is a fluffy vision and mission statement that everybody can get behind, but doesn't really say anything about who you are and where you're going as a company. Not a set of goals with underlying strategies with related objectives that need to be delivered on, but a clear statement of problem, solution, and action to be able to deliver on that problem. And then there's the question of, well, what are the means by which you can leverage that? And that's really where we get into the heart of the book. The main section, the second section, once he's introduced the explanation of good strategy and bad strategy, is really about, so what are the sources of underlying potential power here to be able to leverage? And that can be everything from competitive advantage, which implies that there is some relevance of value that we're able to bring to the table that others aren't, and the ability to be able to make an impact with the resources that we have that differentiate us from other organizations. Building on his role in helping to create the idea of the resource-based view of the firm, one of the sources of power is potentially resources. And the idea that resources, if they're going to be a source of strategic leverage, need to be valuable, they need to be rare, they need to be costly for others to be able to imitate, so they are not something that is able to be readily done by other competing organizations, and they need to be non-substitutable. They need to be resources that are unique to you, that others cannot take on other different but related ways of accomplishing the same overall result. And the organization needs to be organized to be able to exploit them. So it's not just to have the resources, but you've actually then got to organize to be able to realize the results from actually using those resources. He talks about, and this is a wonderful section, about proximate objectives, that it's not about setting a big, hairy, audacious goal. And if I never hear that term or the acronym BHAG again, I'll be a very, very happy person. Because the challenge with that is, how do you attain that? And how do you, again, relate that back to the underlying problem that you're trying to solve? And the idea of a proximate objective is it is something that you can reasonably be expected to hit, be successful in delivering, that will move you in a positive direction, and that then can lead to other subsequent follow-on objectives that may actually be more complex. And so a proximate objective is setting a clear target for something the organization is going to focus its attention on that can hit, that can be successful, that is meaningful, that is going to move the organization forward. And a wonderful example that he uses is JFK's State of the Union address, where he commits to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Now, for many sitting out in television land watching that, that sounded like the most audacious and fantastical objective possible. The idea of putting a man on the surface of the moon where no one had ever walked before. That was not a fantastical objective. That was actually a response to a very specific request that JFK asked of his vice president, LBJ, to go and research how can we beat the Soviets in the space race in a way that we can be successful. And after a period of research and exploration and feasibility analysis, this was the solution that was proffered. We have the resources, we have the capacity, we have the technology, and with work, we have the ability to actually be able to put a man on the moon where the Soviets do not have the same capacity. There's the opportunity to be able to put men in orbit and a crew in orbit, but that would have been certainly a race within the realm of what the Soviets could have done at the time. But to actually be able to move on and land men on the moon and return them safely was still work within the context of what NASA and the American space industry could actually accomplish, but attainable. And sufficiently attainable there and sufficiently unattainable by the Soviets that made that a worthwhile proximate objective. He talks about the role of design, and this is something we're going to talk about in future reviews as we actually tackle the intersection of strategy and design thinking. But he talks about the role of design as being a potential source of strategic advantage, and particularly the value there of coordinated action that can be taken in order to be able to accomplish that. And the ability then to be able to integrate parts together in a way that creates an advantageous solution that is different and unique than what is otherwise possible. And the challenge there of the competing tension between resources available to be able to accomplish that and the degree of tight coupling and coordination to be able to accomplish the goal. And so with a infinite number of resources and capacity, tight coordination isn't necessary. The finer and finer it gets, the more there needs to be tight coordination between that. And you can think about that in terms of the design of a computer, the design of a lunar landing module, for example, and the ability to be able to have all of the systems functioning within the weight of what the launch platform is capable of actually delivering to space. You can think about that in the design of a car. If you're wanting to be able to create a luxury sedan versus a high-performance sports car, how the systems need to be both designed differently and integrated differently in order to be able to define and deliver on the driving experience that is the overall objective. And the fact that that requires coordinated effort across the various components in order to be able to be successful. And one of his key examples that he uses, and it's really kind of a case that wraps all of this up, is the rise of NVIDIA, which in the early 2000s still was not the market dominant leader that it is now. And their strategy that they identified after the failure of their very first product that allowed them to be successful. And the idea there that there were some fundamental coordinated policies they were pursuing, leveraging advances in chip density that had been realized in terms of the manufacture of processors, choosing to adopt when it was still very early, but with a very promising development path, Microsoft's DirectX graphics language. the breaking out of 18-month product cycles that were basically a product of Moore's Law. Moore's Law said that the density on a chip doubles every 18 to 24 months. And what NVIDIA consciously chose is to break out of that 18-month cycle and move to a 6-month product launch. So every 6 months, they would be coming out with a new product. Now, they didn't do that by denying the reality of that's what it takes to be able to design a complex new solution. Their strategy to deal with that was actually having 3 parallel development cycles going at any given time, staggered by a period of 6 months. And so every 6 months from the experience of the market, there would be a launch of a new product. And even if there was a delay or a month or two, it was still proximate to whenever the last previous launch was. It was an opportunity to be able to keep market front of mind, to be able to keep more likelihood of having leading edge products in the market, and to be able to take advantage of organizing in a way that none of their other competitors at the time were set up to be able to deal with. And so all of those strategies came together in terms of then the plan of action that they pursued in order to be able to actually attain market dominance. And all of this is fundamentally predicated on having a reasonable understanding of what's going on and the challenge that's being encountered and how to actually be able to respond to it. Now, that's everything that I loved about the book. What did the author miss? I would start with, we've got a delineation of good. And so we've got an understanding of what good strategy actually looks like. The challenge there is being able to determine what's effective strategy. And this is where strategic context is open to interpretation, and what you choose depends on the diagnosis that you actually arrive at. And you're never going to know whether it was effective until it plays out. So every case study that's contained within the book is designed to illustrate the point the author is actually trying to make. And you've got the benefit of hindsight, being able to say, this is the perfect story that illustrates this particular point. The challenge there is, on a go-forward basis, I might take those insights, I might take that framework of thinking about what good strategy looks like. I might look at a particular source of potential leverage. How do I know I've got the right diagnosis, I have established an effective policy, and my actions are coherent and appropriate and the best ones to pursue now to solve the reality of where I am? That is a guess. It's an educated guess, and that's an important point. But you will not know until you see how it actually plays out. And so this becomes the challenge, is there's great framing of what constitutes strategy, there's good reinforcement of strategic thinking, and there's value in the idea of the logic and reason and critical thinking abilities to be able to deal with, but there's still the question of practically, well, how do I do this? And in particular, what do I need to be thinking about to be able to make that work and be able to work well? And to a certain extent, that's the point, because strategy is hard. And it relies upon a level of judgment, and it relies on a level of clear-eyed evaluation of what's going on, and being comfortable that we've got a reasonable sense of it, that we know what the problem is, and that we know what the solutions are that are possible, and that we're comfortable we have the resources that are available to be able to make them happen. And Rumelt acknowledges this, and it's important to be able to recognize that. So I want to share with you a passage from the book that I think is really useful and relevant in being able to reinforce what does this mean and how does this actually work. And so we get to strategy as a hypothesis. Standing in the hangar-sized Hughes Electronics fabrication facility, I marvel at the huge communication satellite. It gleams and sparkles like a jewel, each part fashioned with exquisite precision. A modern cathedral, the 18,000-pound device embodies the highest skills and knowledge of my civilization. In it, the technologies of orbital mechanics, solar power, three-axis orientation, and sophisticated computation, as well as the reception, amplification, and beaming of electromagnetic waves over entire continents, are woven together into a working harmony that will last decades unattended in stationary orbit, 22,500 miles above the Earth's surface. I'm working with Hughes Electronics to help managers develop strategies for their businesses. Communication satellites, spy satellites, missile systems, various other aerospace activities. My clients are engineers who have risen to management positions by ability at performing, organizing, and directing technical work. I'd started by having them look at various examples of competitive strategy. A month later, we did a short study of the communications satellite business, and today we're digging into the problem of creating strategies for the various business units. As we try to make progress, there was a growing sense of frustration. Partway into the session, Barry, an experienced engineering manager, speaks for several others, saying, "This strategy stuff is nonsense. Give me a break. There is no clear theory. Look, what we need is a way of knowing what will happen if we do A versus what will happen if we do B. Then we can work out what will be the best strategy. We're actually very good at planning here. You can't build a major aerospace system without meticulous planning, but this strategy stuff seems vacuous." Barry's attack hits home. I'd once been an engineer, and I know an engineer doesn't design a bridge that might hold its load. An engineer starts with complexity and crafts certainty. I knew what it was like to be careful to balance literally thousands of considerations in making a system work, and I knew how maddening it was to be able to move from their world to business, where an executive can choose an action based on gut feel, and, even a year later, no one will know whether it was a good choice. I search my mind for a response. Struggling for an answer, I make a connection between business strategy and the process of science. Where does scientific knowledge come from? You know the process. A good scientist pushes to the edge of knowledge and then reaches beyond, forming a conjecture, a hypothesis, about how things work in that unknown territory. If the scientist avoids the edge, working with what is already well known and established, life will be comfortable, but there will be neither fame nor honor. In the same way, a good business strategy deals with the edge between the known and the unknown. Again, it's competition with others that pushes us to the edge of knowledge. Only there are found the opportunities to be able to keep ahead of rivals. There's no avoiding it. That uneasy sense of ambiguity you feel is real. It is the scent of opportunity. In science, you first test a new conjecture against known laws and experience. Is the new hypothesis contradicted by basic principles or by the results of past experiments? If the hypothesis survives that test, the scientist has to devise a real-world test, an experiment, to see how well the hypothesis stands up. Similarly, we test new strategic insight against well-established principles and against our accumulated knowledge about the business. If it passes those hurdles, we're faced with trying it out and seeing what happens. Given that we're working on the edge, asking for a strategy that is guaranteed to work is like asking a scientist for a hypothesis that's guaranteed to be true. It's a dumb request. The problem of coming up with a good strategy has the same logical structure as the problem of coming up with most scientific knowledge and a good scientific hypothesis. The key difference are that most scientific knowledge is broadly shared, whereas you're working with accumulated wisdom about your business and your industry that is unlike anyone else's. A good strategy, in the end, is a hypothesis about what will work. Not a wild theory, but an educated judgment. And there isn't anyone more educated about your business than the group in this room. And so he recognizes a good strategy is hard and good strategy is uncertain. And we're not going to be able to know how this plays out until it actually does play out. So my recommendation, should you read this book? Absolutely. I would recommend rereading it and rereading it again, and then diving into specific examples as needed that lends itself well to doing that. It is well structured. It actually has one of the best table of contents that I've seen in a business book, and that table of contents is an excellent summary of what's contained within each chapter. So if there's something you're looking for, you can actually scan and find it quite quickly. Now, what should you look for? Embrace and internalize what strategy means. This I think is really the gift of the book and its overall value. Progressively build up an understanding of what the sources of strategic power are. All of them are good to be able to understand. Some of them are going to be more relevant to you today, and you want to dig deep and perhaps actually research elsewhere as well. Others are going to be, while useful to understand now, maybe not necessarily as immediately practical. But how deep should you go? As deep as you need to right now, but deep enough to be able to immerse yourself in the foundational principles of what Rumelt is talking about. Be able to carry around those ideas and concepts and be able to recognize those patterns in real life scenarios, whether that's what you're experiencing directly at work or whether it is what you're observing in other organizations that you read about in the newspaper or in a book or in a periodical or magazine. But it provides you with an easy ability to then to be able to springboard and go deeper, both into the literature and other books. So when we think about the book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, as I say, it is a wonderful book. It is one of the better books that I have read more recently, and it is certainly one that I would recommend you taking a look at. Thanks for joining us on Strategy Books. We'll be back with another episode soon. If you're interested in the books we talked about today, you can find links to them in the description below. Be sure to subscribe. If you enjoyed today's recording, please hit that like button as well and help others be able to find the recording. Let me know what you got out of the book in the comments below, and comment as well if you have questions or if you've got ideas for a future book. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.